Welcome back to Listen, everybody. If you're enjoying the show, please hit that like button while you listen. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into something a little different.
Oh,
Yeah, we're going to be talking about true crime.
Yep.
But not just like, the stories themselves.
right.
We're going to be looking at the psychology behind our true crime obsession and how it might be impacting us
Interesting.
more than we realize.
Yeah.
So to guide this deep dive, we're going to be looking at this article called True Crime and Trauma: How Our Fascination with Real Crime Stories Impacts Mental Health.
Okay.
I think we can all relate to that in some way. So get ready to unlock some surprising insights about your favorite genre and maybe even learn a thing or two about yourself along the way. So to kick things off, it's no secret that true crime is having a major moment right now.
Oh, yeah.
Podcasts, documentaries, books, you name it. People just can't seem to get enough of it. But why?
Well, I think it's partly because it speaks to something very primal in us.
Okay.
This fascination with mysteries and whodunits. Right.
It goes way back. Like you think about our ancestors, they had to be constantly aware of danger, recognizing threats, understanding behavioral patterns. It was essential for their survival.
So it's like we have this internal radar always on the lookout for danger, even if it's coming from a podcast instead of a, wild animal.
Exactly.
Yep.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's like we're hardwired for these stories. And what's interesting is the article argues that there's more to true crime than just entertainment.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It often dives into things like forensic science, criminal profiling, the psychology of criminals, and learning about this stuff can actually be empowering.
Okay.
Because when you understand how some minds work, it can make you feel safer.
Like if I can spot the signs, I can avoid becoming a victim.
Precisely. But here's where things get a little more complicated.
Okay.
The article suggests that this kind of thinking can go too far.
Well, it brings up this idea of hypervigilance, where you're constantly on high alert, looking for danger everywhere. Always checking your locks, feeling like someone is watching you, jumping at every little sound.
Oh, I could definitely see how that could be a problem.
Yeah. And get this, the article even mentions a study from 2010 where true crime fans experienced physical responses similar to those who'd actually experienced trauma.
Seriously.
Yeah. Think about that. Your body reacting as if you were in danger just from listening to a story.
That's unsettling.
It is. And you know what else is interesting? The article points out that true crime often focuses on this idea of stranger danger.
Right.
But in reality, most crimes are committed by people we know.
That's a good point.
Yeah, the FBI statistics show that the majority of violent crimes are committed by someone the victim already knows. But, the world of true crime, it tends to focus on these stranger-driven cases. It ends up creating a kind of skewed perception of risk.
So we end up fearing the wrong things.
In a way, yeah. The article gives examples like people avoiding certain places at night or, carrying self-defense tools because they have this exaggerated fear of being randomly attacked. And while it's good to be aware of your surroundings, that level of fear can really impact your life.
Makes you wonder if we're just trading one type of anxiety for another.
Right.
So how can we tell if our interest in true crime is becoming a problem? Like, are there any red flags we should be looking out for?
Yeah. The article highlights a few signs. Increased paranoia, where you're constantly checking your surroundings or just feeling like danger is lurking everywhere.
Okay.
Also, keep an eye on your sleep quality. A lot of people report having nightmares or just generally poor sleep after consuming true crime content.
I've definitely been there.
It makes sense, though, right?
Yeah.
Our subconscious minds are still processing all that disturbing content even after we've, turned off the podcast or TV show. Another thing to watch out for is social withdrawal. The article suggests that some people who consume a lot of true crime, they start to trust others less and avoid social situations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then there's persistent anxiety if you find yourself constantly on edge or you start fearing for your safety in everyday situations. That's a big one.
Yeah, that sounds serious.
It is. And that kind of chronic anxiety, it can lead to other health problems too, digestive issues, headaches, even high blood pressure. It really takes a toll.
So what's the solution? Should we all just swear off true crime forever?
Well, not necessarily. The goal isn't to abandon the genre entirely. I mean, true crime can be captivating and even educational. It's all about finding a healthy balance.
Okay, I like the sound of that. But how do we actually strike that balance? Like, what are some practical tips for enjoying true crime without letting it take over our lives?
Well, the article offers a few suggestions. First, set limits on how much you consume. Maybe designate certain days or times for true crime and try to stick to that schedule.
Like a true crime budget.
Exactly. It's also important to balance true crime with more positive content. So after a particularly intense story, switch to something lighter, a comedy special, a nature documentary, even just some calming music. Anything to help reset your mental state.
That's good advice.
And probably the most important thing is to monitor your reactions. Pay attention to how you feel after listening to or watching true crime. If you notice any anxiety or fear, take a break.
Okay.
And lastly, remember to ground yourself in reality.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's easy to get lost in the world of true crime and start believing that the world is much more dangerous than it actually is. Remember, most people are good, and violent crime, especially stranger-driven crime, is relatively rare statistically.
That's a good point. It's like we need to consciously counter the narrative that true crime often presents.
Exactly. It's about maintaining perspective. We've talked a lot about the psychological impact of true crime.
Yeah.
But there are other aspects to consider, too.
Like what?
Well, I think that's a good place to pause, and we can pick up this conversation in part 2 of our deep dive.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into true crime.
So we just spent the last segment talking about all the potential downsides of true crime.
Yeah.
All the anxiety, the paranoia, even sleep problems. But obviously, there's another side to this.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, there's a reason why true crime is so popular, why so many of us are drawn to it.
Right?
So I'm curious, what do you see as some of the positive aspects of true crime?
Well, for one, it's captivating. Like, you think about it, it taps into this really natural curiosity that we have about the human psyche, like why people do the things they do, you know?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And then on top of that, it can actually be educational.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah?
Yeah.
We learn about forensic science, the criminal justice system, different types of crimes. I mean, it can even make us more aware of our surroundings, you know?
Right, yeah, more cautious, I guess.
Exactly. But in a healthy way, hopefully. Not to the point where we're afraid to leave the house.
Right, it's all about finding that balance.
Exactly. Now, I do want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, though.
Okay.
And that's the ethical considerations surrounding true crime.
Right, I think that's a really important aspect that often gets overlooked.
Because when you think about it, these stories, they're based on real-life events. These are real people who have experienced, you know, sometimes unimaginable trauma.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important to remember that, you know, as consumers of this content, we have a responsibility to engage with it ethically.
So how can we do that?
Well, the article talked a lot about supporting creators who handle these stories with empathy and respect.
Right, like creators who are prioritizing the victim stories.
Yeah. Over, like, sensationalism or shock value. And there are some incredible creators out there doing just that, you know.
Totally.
Journalists, podcasters, filmmakers who are dedicated to telling these stories with sensitivity and nuance. And as viewers, as listeners, we can choose to support those creators, right?
Absolutely.
Like vote with our downloads, our subscriptions, you know?
Yeah, our views.
Exactly. We can also support organizations that advocate for victims' rights.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah. There are so many incredible groups doing such important work out there.
I think it's also important to be mindful of the language that we use when discussing true crime.
Oh, that's a great point.
We need to move away from using terms that, you know, dehumanize or objectify victims,
Right.
like case or story. We need to remember these are real people,
Absolutely.
and their experiences deserve to be treated with respect.
Now, one thing I have noticed, and I think is a positive development, is that some podcasts, some shows, they've started incorporating interviews with family members.
Oh, yeah.
Or friends of the victims.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because it gives those voices a platform. It helps to humanize the victims and remind us that these crimes, they had real-world consequences.
For sure. It also allows us to hear about the victims' lives beyond the crime,
Right.
like their personalities, their passions.
Exactly.
It helps us to see them as individuals,
Yeah.
not just characters in a story. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can do as true crime fans.
To remember the humanity.
Exactly. Speaking of remembering the humanity behind these stories, the article also talked about the importance of self-care for true crime fans.
Oh, for sure. It's crucial to be aware of the potential impact these stories can have on our mental health and to take steps to protect ourselves.
Yeah, we already talked about setting limits,
Right.
balancing true crime with other types of content.
Yeah.
But are there other things that we can be doing?
Yeah, like practicing other forms of self-care.
Yeah.
Things like exercise, spending time in nature, meditation, even talking to a therapist, you know, if needed.
It's like we're detectives of our own minds, paying attention to the clues, like our bodies and emotions are giving us.
I like that.
If we start noticing those warning signs like, the increased anxiety, difficulty sleeping, feeling on edge, it's time to take a step back,
Absolutely.
reevaluate.
Yeah. Another thing the article mentioned that I thought was really interesting, it said that connecting with other true crime fans and just having open and honest conversations about these issues can be really helpful.
Oh, like a support group kind of thing.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's so important to create a space for dialogue and to share our experiences because it helps us feel less alone, more supported.
It's like we're creating a community
Yeah,
of conscious true crime consumers
I like that.
where we can explore our fascination, but also acknowledge those ethical and psychological complexities.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's about enjoying true crime
Yeah,
in a way that enriches our lives without compromising our mental well-being.
I love that. So we've talked about the impact on individuals, but I'm curious, what about the broader impact of true crime? Like, where do you see this genre headed in the future?
That's a great question. I think we're going to continue to see this emphasis on ethical storytelling.
Okay.
More and more creators prioritizing the voices and experiences of victims and their families.
Yeah, it does feel like there's been a shift in that direction,
Right.
which is really encouraging.
It's great, yeah. I think audiences are demanding that, They're
Right.
demanding more nuance, more sensitivity, more accountability.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah. Means that we're having these conversations.
Exactly.
I'm glad.
You know what else I think we're going to see more of?
What?
I think we're going to start seeing more exploration of the systemic issues that contribute to crime.
Oh, interesting.
So instead of just focusing on, the individual perpetrators, we're going to start to look at like the social, economic, political factors,
You like the bigger picture.
Exactly. And I think that could lead to, more productive conversations about crime prevention and restorative justice.
I'm also really curious to see how technology is going to continue to shape how we consume and interact with true crime.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're already seeing a lot of innovation.
Absolutely.
Interactive documentaries, virtual reality experiences. There's even AI being used to analyze crime data.
It's amazing. But I think with all of these advancements, it's more important than ever to remember the human element,
Yeah, for sure.
We need to make sure that technology is used to enhance our understanding of crime and its impacts, but not to dehumanize the victims.
Right. Or sensationalize events.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought.
Yep.
The next time you listen to a true crime podcast, watch a documentary, take a moment to think about the real people behind that story. Ask yourself, is this helping me understand the world, or is it just feeding my fear?
I think that's a really powerful question to consider.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of part 2 of our true crime deep dive.
Already.
I know, right? Time flies when you're having fun and talking about murder. We'll be right back with the final part of our deep dive after a quick break. Welcome back to our final part of this deep dive into the world of true crime.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has. We've talked about the psychological impact,
Mm-hmm.
how it can lead to anxiety,
Right.
even impact our sleep.
Yeah.
But, one thing that really struck me from the article was how the rise of true crime podcasts has actually led to some breakthroughs in cold cases.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the most incredible things to come out of this whole true crime boom,
It is. I mean,
Yeah.
it makes sense when you think about it. You have literally millions of people listening to these cases, analyzing every detail.
Right.
And sometimes they even uncover information that investigators might have missed.
It's like crowdsourcing for justice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like we're all armchair detectives, but on a massive scale.
And there have been so many instances where, listeners have reached out to law enforcement with tips or theories that have actually helped move investigations forward.
It's incredible. Like, true crime isn't always about fear and anxiety.
Yeah.
It can actually be a force for good.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the power of storytelling, right?
Yeah.
When these stories are told responsibly with sensitivity and accuracy, they can actually have a really positive impact on the world. So I guess that's a good note to end on. Remember, next time you're listening to your favorite true crime podcast or watching a documentary, take a moment to think about the real people behind the story. Ask yourself, is this helping me understand the world, or is it just feeding my fear?
That's such a great reminder. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of true crime.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you learned something new, gained a fresh perspective, and maybe even had some of your assumptions challenged.
And until next time, stay curious and stay safe.
We'll see you in the next episode.